Good afternoon. Well, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Hi, Gojko.
Hello.
Ciao. Good to see you, and good to see all of you back for another year of small talks here at Avans Coperta. I am Enrico. I'm very excited to present another event with you. So this year we kick off in great style with Gojko Adzic, whom we've had the pleasure to host last year as well, for a small talk about impact mapping. But Gojko has another workshop that we are doing next month, focused on specification by example, which is also the title of another of his books. So with small talk, what we really want to do is understand a bit more about what's behind the scenes of, a topic, a theory, or something that a trainer is teaching. We are going to do that in an informal way, so we don't have slides, something that I'm sure Gojko is grateful for, as well as all the other trainers. And together with you, we are gonna deep dive a bit into this topic. So today we're gonna talk about specification by example. I'll repeat it again. You also see it here. The YouTube chat is open. So I see Morten. Hi, welcome. And each one of you, if you're having lunch, breakfast, whatever, you want to stay with us for some 30 minutes, we're gonna talk about specification by example. And your questions are part of the event. So on the YouTube chat, you can ask Gojko some questions if you wish, as we go along with the conversation. If you have any doubts about the workshop, about the book, well, now is the time. So are we ready, Gojko? Let's do this. So first of all, we always start with, definitions and what's what. So what is specification by example?
Spec by example is a collaborative approach to requirements and tests, and it's by far the fastest way I know to get people from different roles, testers, developers, analysts, product owners, to agree on what they want to build and how they want to test it. Spec by example works really, really well in short iterative delivery cycles, and it's probably one of the few things that does work well for requirements and testing in short iterative cycles because it is fast. Usually when people do a 2-week development cycle, they don't have a lot of time to do proper analysis, to do all the stuff they need to do individually to figure out what they want to build, to transfer that knowledge to people who need to build it, then to figure out how they want to test it. And Spec by example just makes that process work really well. As a technique, it usually is done within kind of a Scrum or Kanban style process. It's a cornerstone of basically iterative software delivery quality, and it's also used within the context of behavior-driven development quite a lot. People come usually to Spec by example from that perspective as well. And it's essentially a way for different roles to define and do collaborative analysis together that results in some very concrete examples of system usage, intended system usage, and helps then create both a shared understanding of what needs to be built, but then a really good starting point for the definition of the acceptance criteria and test cases and later documentation for improving the system.
Excellent. Thanks, Gojko. That's already a lot to talk about. I'll take the occasion to welcome and greet Chris, whom I met in London, I think, at one of the Skills Matter conferences back in the day. Hi, Chris. So he has an observation already, which I want to highlight. So Spec by example works well in DevOps too, where you need to do things fast, but often the requirements are a quick conversation.
And I think generally kind of any time where you have multiple roles and people generally used to different types of sources of truth or types of information, and you need to communicate across the roles quickly. Examples tend to be a really, really good way of doing that. In psychology, that's kind of called a boundary object. That's something that you can put between two different people that they can all use as a way of bouncing ideas off each other and clarifying things. And generally, we use examples in everyday communication anyway to clarify things. If you Google for the phrase "for example," you're going to find hundreds of millions of results. And Spec by Example just takes that idea and uses it to build a slightly more formal way of getting an agreement or flashing out disagreements very quickly. So, DevOps is a nice example of where you have multiple different roles, typically kind of somebody doing operations work and development work together, but they have different types of stakeholders that are developers or business stakeholders or testers, and figuring out exactly what needs to happen there is usually a challenge that needs to, a communication challenge that needs to cross different roles, and examples are a good way of doing that.
Absolutely. And we've seen this with many tools, techniques, and approaches that we talk about, especially in Advanced Coperta, event storming being one of them, which leads me to the next question, which wasn't planned, but that's the beauty of small talk. So how does specification by example happen in reality? Like, what tools do you use, and how does this thing actually happen?
So there are several aspects. There are several aspects to Spec by Example. One key aspect is to do analysis collaboratively, and there's lots of different ways of doing that depending on the size of the group that needs to be involved, and whether they are co-located or remote and things like that. These patterns have kind of been documented in my Spec by Example book, and Craig Larman also wrote some really, really good patterns about that in Practices for Scaling Lean and Agile. And I think looking at the size of the group, for example, if you have a very small group of, say, 3 or 4 people, you don't have to have a lot of formality in how these conversations happen, as long as people know how to use examples and bounce them off each other. And usually the pattern for that is called the 3 amigos. It used to be 1 developer, 1 tester, and 1 analyst when we started with that, because analysts were still a thing. And today, most organizations have renamed analysts to product owners and just kind of not really given these people the skills to do product ownership. So they still do analysis, but it doesn't matter. So you have these kind of 3 different roles usually, and they use examples. Usually somebody who represents the business, the analyst to the product owner, comes with some initial examples. Testers and developers try to complain about that and try to think about additional things that would be important from a development or a testing perspective, and they just try to agree on these examples. When you have a slightly larger group, you need to get things a bit more formal. With, say, 5 to 10, 15 people, usually I would suggest doing feedback exercises. Feedback exercises are a great way to check for shared understanding or misunderstanding, and it comes from a book called The Sources of Power by Gary Klein. And it was part of his recommendation how to clarify understanding in the US military as part of the commander's intent template. And a feedback exercise is based on the idea that most misunderstanding comes around boundaries and edge cases, that people will usually agree on a happy day scenario. So again, somebody who represents a business, a product owner, an analyst, or somebody who's done a bit of upfront analysis will explain something and present a few initial cases with some happy day scenarios. And then people get to think about boundaries or edge cases, but not really talk about out loud what the expected outcome is in these cases. They list these things, and then somebody who facilitates the workshop would individually announce each case, explain it a bit, and then everybody has a minute or 2 to think about the expected outcome and write it down on a piece of paper individually. Or if you're doing a remote session, think about it and then paste it into the Zoom chat at the same time, or reveal it on a Miro board. And the idea with that is that everybody has to individually think about a difficult edge case and explain their understanding. because we use concrete examples, they have to really come up with a concrete outcome. And then the facilitator can very easily see if everybody has a shared understanding or if we have differences in understanding. If somebody has different outcome from the rest of the group, then they understood the case differently. And that often opens up a really good discussion on, why did we miss this? Did we have a wrong assumption? Does that person have some deeper knowledge that other people don't have? And things like that. So that kind of facilitation works really well for groups of, say, 5 to 10, 15 people. Above that, I tend to use diverge and merge style workshops where we get a larger group split into several smaller groups. And in the first part, that's the diverge part, each individual group works on a whiteboard, a flip chart on a virtual board where they document their understanding of a piece of requirements or a task with some concrete examples, usually for 10 or 15 minutes. They write down how they understand this. They try to get into, again, boundaries and write down the expected outcomes in the boundaries. And then the facilitator compares what different groups have written down. And this is an amazingly quick way for a very large group of people to visualize their understanding. I've done it with 30, 40 people in the room. Virtually, we can do it with even more very easily. And different groups will visualize their understanding. And again, similar to the feedback exercises, we look for differences. We look for same or similar examples with different outcomes. We look for differences in structure. We look for question marks. And that helps very quickly spot differences in understanding, spot misunderstandings, spot different opinions. And then a single facilitator can coordinate a good discussion and make sure that everybody's on the same page. So those would be the three key ways of doing things. There is a fourth way I try to avoid if possible. In the Spec by Example book, we call that write and review. And that's when one person writes their understanding of something with examples and sends it to everybody else to complain and review. I don't like that one because it doesn't support collaborative analysis. I think based on my experience and based on what Larman wrote in Practices for Scaling Lean and Agile, collaborative analysis is one of the big differentiators between successful iterative teams and less successful iterative teams. And getting one person to write things down and then get everybody else to review that is not really collaborative analysis. It's a chance for feedback. So there is that option as well. And I think that option is particularly useful if a team is very highly distributed and time zones don't allow you to meet at all. But doing something more collaborative is actually a lot better.
Wow, that's excellent. Thanks for the overview. And I'm sure we'll see some of these next month in our workshop as well. I'll drop the link.
In the workshop, we go through all these kind of practical ways of getting to the examples quickly. I mean, the key point of Spec by Example is it helps us get to alignment quickly. It flushes out misunderstanding. It shows problematic wrong assumptions. It helps us spot what people did not understand well or understood differently. And the key thing there is really to do that quickly. So facilitation techniques for getting to the right examples quickly are amazingly important. And we cover them in depth in the workshop.
Amazing. Thanks. So we had the first question. I'll read it and show it here on the screen. Thanks, Bruno. So I understand that the right place for this exercise in a Scrum context would be refinement and planning. Do you have any pitfalls to share, things that work or don't? I think this was asked about the probably first or second type of exercise you were mentioning.
Well, I mean, so in a sense, Bruno is right. The doing collaborative analysis is a faster way to do refinement and plan. Kind of planning, I guess, has two parts. Planning has figuring out what we do and then prioritization. This doesn't really help with prioritization, but it happens with the first part, understanding what we do. And I think, again, this practice has been around for probably 30 or 40 years in different variants. And I think we've kind of codified it as a community pretty well about 15 years ago. And there's lots of ways of getting this wrong. One way of getting this wrong is for one person to do all the analysis and just present examples, and everybody else disconnecting because they think all the analysis is already done. And again, that's why I like doing analysis collaboratively, to make sure that we flush out people's misunderstanding. Another pitfall is where people don't really look at the boundaries. They only look at a few happy day scenarios and they codify that with examples. And the reason why this is bad is most of the misunderstanding actually comes from boundaries, and it comes at boundaries of knowledge, comes at edge cases, and getting to the difficult edge cases is really important. But very few people have good skills on how to get to these boundaries. And again, that's why it's important to mix developers, testers, analysts, because testers will be usually better equipped to come up with boundaries, but product people will know how to set the context. Developers will know how the existing system works, or how similar problems can emerge, and then propose their perspective. The third kind of typical pitfall is to let the tool drive the types of examples people can express. And that's why I very much prefer doing this either with whiteboards or flip charts, or if I'm doing this in a remote setting using some kind of open board type like Miro, instead of starting with Excel or Word. Because if you start with Excel, you're 100% guaranteed to end up with a table. If you start with Word, you're very, very likely to end up with bullet points and nested bullet points, because that's easy to do. Or kind of some online equivalent of Word, but maybe a drawing would be a better way to capture an example for a flow, or maybe a mix of sentences and tables would be better to use. And having some like free form boarding tool, or having pens and a physical board is letting people structure examples in the best way for that specific scenario, instead of being constrained by a tool. The worst possible offense for something like that is to use Jira and start collecting examples directly in Jira. I think because Jira even doesn't even have a decent editor for any of these things. And then people get stuck in formatting issues in how to structure it. So I think start with something that's free form and then refine it later, and separate out collaborative analysis from refinement. Again, that's one of the key things, how to do this right.
That's excellent, and probably is one of those cases where remote help, because we can have a collaborative tool in a free form such as Miro.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I still like whiteboards and flip charts. And
unless you have
and I guess with everybody working from home, not a lot of people have whiteboard and flip charts at home, and that's the problem. But these digital tools like Miro and Mural and things like that are good, as long as people don't get stuck too much on the tooling aspect of it. But when the tool starts shaping your discussion and preventing you from expressing things you want to express, like drawing a diagram or using a wireframe, or using a bit of tabular data, then it's an obstacle rather than a facilitator.
Absolutely. So before we go into the next question from the audience, thanks for keep writing to us. So Specification by Example is also a book that you wrote into. Well, it was published in 2011, if I'm not wrong. So it's about 11 years old. How did the process of getting there started?
Well, I guess Spec by Example, as I said, as a practice is probably in different forms 30 or 40 years old. David Parnas used concrete tables to specify things probably in the 70s or early 80s. Ward Cunningham used what later became Spec by Example while working on the Ycache Plus project that was, I think, in late 80s or early 90s, and that's documented on the C2 Wiki. in exploring requirements, Donald Gauss and Jerry Weinberg talked about using test cases to flush out misunderstanding about requirements and getting people to complain on concrete test cases early on while reviewing requirements, which is one of the basis of Spec by Example. And the book was published, I think, in 91 or 92. So we're again talking about late 80s. But generally, I think the boost for Spec by Example came from Ward's work and Rick Mugridge's work on FIT. That was early 2000s. And Kent Beck's idea of customer tests. In Extreme Programming Explained, Kent talked about test-driven development from two perspectives. One was the perspective of developer tests, and these were test-driven technical design tests that would help us figure out the design correctly. And he talked about customer tests that were something that would help us do test-driven development on business requirements. And lots of people were really struggling with the implementation of that because XP customers and product owners, business analysts were not really able to read code. So codifying these tests was a challenge. And the work that Ward was doing around that time with a tool called FIT helped again bridge that gap, because he was using things that emerged from the Ycash Plus project. Ycash Plus was a financial planning tool, and they were using spreadsheets as examples. And FIT was enabling people to use human readable tables in HTML documents as customer tests that would be fully automated. A bunch of tools emerged later from that. Fitness with kind of Uncle Bob Martin and Micah Martin. That was a nice web interface to that. Concordion that David Peterson created, and lots of kind of similar tools. JBehave that Dan North and Liz Keogh were working on around the same time, and this is where Given When Then emerged. And Cucumber came a bit later. So there was a lot of innovation in the early 2000s and mid 2000s when the community was trying to figure out, how do we actually implement this idea of customer tests? How do we create something that is automatable, but still developers, testers, analysts, customers can understand it the same way? And Spec by Example, the book, came out of my kind of obsession with how effective this good is as a practice, and my wish that more people learn about that and use it in their process. I saw how powerful this is in mid 2000s on several projects, and then I realized how important this is as part of a iterative process. And back then, this wasn't really a well-known practice, so I was kind of trying to get people to learn more about that. And Spec by Example is actually my third book on that topic. I published a book on how to use Fitness, the tool, in 2007, I think, and then Bridging the Communication Gap came out in 2008 or 9. And when I published Bridging the Communication Gap, that was explaining my experiences with the process, but I wanted to document that other people were doing that as well. And Spec by Example, the book, came as a result of a wider industry research that documented 50 really good case studies, how people are doing it in banks, in insurance companies, in large travel booking sites and things like that. I wanted to show people that this is not some kind of black magic weird thing that only small teams can do, but actually how large organizations have already implemented that in practice. Because by the time the Spec by Example book came out, I think we crossed from early adopters to kind of people where this was becoming an established practice, and there were some really good ways of adopting this for lots of different types of organizations. And as you said, this was 12 or 13 years ago, so now this is really a well-documented, well-established practice.
Nice story, thanks. Good to see, there's a lot of case studies already in the book. I was about to ask, can you tell us something, but we leave that for the book, as there's 50. I know it's 11 years ago, but I'm sure that will do.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to single out some specific case study. Usually, kind of the effect of doing spec by example for organizations where people really have this problem that can be solved. So delays in delivery, misunderstandings, rework caused by misunderstandings or with kind of bugs is to significantly reduce the cycle time from when somebody says, look, this is what we should do, until it goes live and doesn't come back. I worked with a logistics company a few years ago, helping them adopt this, and their average cycle time was 4 or 5 iterations to get something out. Because usually they would develop something, it goes live, then kind of customers complain, then it goes back, then it goes to more analysis, it goes live again, people complain again, then kind of they fix it again, it goes live. And they've reduced that to kind of in average between 1 and 2 cycles. So kind of they've reduced their cycle time by 2 or 3 times. Lots of people that I've interviewed for the book have reported much, much higher quality of their work. They've reported much fewer bugs. There was a wonderful case study in the book about a team where Steve Freeman worked at large investment bank in London, and because it's Steve Freeman and he's a genius, he kind of led and he worked with some other very, very smart people there. They had this critically important system for an investment bank where they had 0 bugs in production for 5 years. And I think that is a wonderful thing to do while still releasing every 2 weeks. And this was, 15 years ago, where people were still claiming that you can't do 2-week iterations in banks.
Not bad, indeed. Okay, we're about to close for today, and I'll read the last question from Dario, unless we have some more. Thanks, Gojko, for all the amazing insight. We wouldn't have known this without this small talk, at least. That's what we hope. So, Dario, ciao, Dario, thank you. So, talking about conversation, can specification by example approach be used to facilitate conversations with end users to gather requirements, strengths, and weaknesses?
So can spec by example be used with end users? Absolutely. There's nothing magical in examples that only people internal to the team would understand. External users also can complain about these examples or can propose their own examples. The strength of spec by example is that you can cross different roles very easily, and you can get people from different roles to understand things and talk about this. The weakness is that it can be used on things that are relatively deterministic, and it can be used for stuff where there is an expected outcome. For example, video games are an area where you can't really use this because the key quality of a video game is for it to be fun. It doesn't have like an expected outcome for a specific scenario or something like that. And even if it does, and even if there are bugs in video games and they're fun, people will keep playing them. But if you hit all the business requirements of a video game, but it's not fun to play, it's still going to be a failure. So things like fun are difficult to describe with examples. But stuff that is deterministic, stuff where there is an expected outcome, or things where you can get people to complain, they can be described with examples nicely. So usually kind of any business calculation rules, things like usability, things like performance, things like wireframes, pretty much anything that is deterministic, you can describe very nicely with examples.
Awesome. Thanks, Gojko. And Dario, if you have any further questions, we are here for I would say another few minutes. The last question I'd like to ask you, Gojko, thank you again for being with us, is, so on 7th of February, we are starting the remote edition of Specification by Example. It's 5 2.5 hour modules. How are we gonna work? So there's gonna be some practice, some theory. What's the
it's kind of, the workshops are a nice mix of theory and practice. Each day has a specific theme. On the first day, we look at how to get misunderstanding flushed out quickly and get shared understanding with examples. On the second day, we look at facilitation techniques for these collaborative analysis workshops. On the third day, we usually look at given, when, then as a format for doing these things. On the fourth day, we look at example mapping and refinements. And on the last day, we look at how that fits into the wider process. So within each day, as I said, there's a main theme, but we split each day into 3 sections. And each section starts with a very quick presentation from me, then a practical hands-on exercise where people try to use these techniques, and then a discussion session where we look at the results of the exercises and talk about the differences and get people to really understand these things the right way and make sure that they have the knowledge and skills to take it to their process. So the workshop is very practical. People spend a lot of time actually doing these things from different perspectives and learn lots of facilitation techniques and lots of interesting ideas they can take back to their companies and improve the process.
That's great. That the way we like it. Lots of exercises and people doing stuff. I would say that is it for today. Is there anything you'd like to add, Gojko?
No, we are kind of if people are interested in this, it would be good fun to do it again with Avanscoperta. So sign up for the workshop.
Exactly. So thanks everyone for being here, for the questions, for the interaction, and we'll see you. If you want to join the workshop, I copied the link in the chat. Later on, I'll also extract the resources that Gojko shared today in terms of books, recommended videos, and what's not. So you'll have all of this in the first comment to the video. We will see you this Friday with another small talk with Matteo Cavucci. We're going to talk about product discovery and lean value tree. So be there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Dave, Dario, Morten, and especially thanks, Gojko. We'll see you next month. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.